become a part of this. So to start, there's many emerging public power fights that are being driven by grassroots organizing and being fought hard by utilities. And they're usually unsupported by mainstream environmental organizations. There's a lot of mixed messaging on equity outcomes of public power and bad faith attacks by opposition on dubious equity concerns. Questions like what about corruption in public sectors? As if investor-owned organizations are completely above reproach. There's a lot of whataboutism. And as energy democracy advocates, we need to have an understanding of the real equity and structural change concerns for future advocacy work. So with a landscape review of communities implementing public power and occurring across the Midwest and beyond, we were able to identify some equity and environmental issues and zero in on opportunities to advance some of this work. The action team's goals were designed with REAMP's North Star goal, and specifically with REAMP's guiding principles of expanding energy democracy and promoting local ownership. And so a little bit more on this project, why it came about, what we set out to do and how we ended up doing the work. As Jackson stated, Eric, and I will share these insights. We're excited to. So the first is considering municipalization. So as communities are facing real challenges right now regarding cost, resilience, and sustainability of their electric utilities, we're seeing results of communities taking action to seek more sustainable solutions, and instead they're forming new public power utilities. Investor-owned utilities are not an energy democracy. So we're seeing escalating crisis of affordability, reliability, resilience, and climate collapse. You can look in, we know this slide or the figures are from 2017, but you can still see the disparity in the amount of people that are served by investor-owned utilities. So the set intentions of the public power project. So these are what we set out to do. We wanted to establish an interstate steering committee to inform the work that's done in this project. So we have people from all over Iowa, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, people all over that were a part of this, and we'll thank the steering committee later on so you can get to know who all had a finger in this project and was able to lend some of their time to this. We conducted landscape analysis of public power efforts in the Midwest, and we went on to try and seek and understand equity issues associated with what municipalization efforts look like and how we can counter those bad faith attacks by opposition, and even not necessarily attacks, but just hesitation from environmental organizations. We went on to identify opportunities to advance the work through campaigns and policy solutions and share ideas. We conducted virtual and in-person interviews in Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois. And that was all done by Jackson and Eric. So thank you for them for the traveling that and the little road trip buddy adventure that they had going forward there. And then we wanted to convene a virtual focus group. So we had 2 focus groups and create virtual file of interviews collected and publishing blogs. And Eric was on top of that. So thank you to Eric for that. And then publish a written report and summary and associated presentation of the insights from the analysis, which we had help from the work department. So thank you to them with that as well, which you all now have access to this report. And then here we are. We're convening an interview right now, hoping that there are participants that were interviewed. We have some steering committee members here, and anybody who's an interested party who wants to discuss this report and any insights that come out of it. So the process of how this worked, we had interview sections and a focus group, or 2 focus groups. So the project team interviewed key stakeholders who have shared interests in equitable and effective public power. That was Jackson and Eric. They interviewed both public officials involved in managing municipal utilities now and community members of those utilities. And then also we're interviewing people in investor-owned utility areas. The goal was to expand on insights from interviews with the group, with group discussions and shared learning. So interviews were grouped geographically, but there were also additional interviews in Chicago, Illinois, and Minneapolis to learn more about local campaigns for municipalization as they were going on. We conducted 2 focus groups with assistance from the work department. And while a vast majority of the participants were interviewees, participants also included some subject matter specialists from the Midwest, and then also others from outside the Midwest region who just added value to conversation in the wider energy market. And I will pass it on now to Eric.
So, thank you for that, Colin. And thank you to all of the folks who helped compile all of our interviews and joined in on all of our focus groups. As far as the report, we compiled 23 pages looking at key insights across all focus groups. We've separated them by focus group insight, and we've laid it out so that at the bottom there are toolkits available to each individual group of stakeholders. So with that, we're pushing out that report. I just want to give you guys the link if you guys haven't read it. It's going to be at cleanwater.org/public power. So the first things that we noticed across all stakeholders that were under existing public power utilities, it was a point of pride for those communities, whether those communities were struggling, whether those communities had amazing public power, whatever it was, the fact that it was their communities mattered to them. Utility operators also, we found, see each other as peers across ownership models. So it's very common that like organizers and activists see like their investor-owned utility as an opposition, but many public power operators see themselves as peers to those investor-owned utilities that these campaigns are trying to replace. Proponents of public power have seen it as essential, have seen it as something that is the only way to take their city's grid back and take control over financial or energy choices in their community, while skeptics have seen it as a tool among many, thinking that we need this among various other options of either public ownership, private ownership, or public-private partnership in order to successfully move forward in the green transition. The last thing under perceptions is like the transfer of assets on our grid and taking responsibility for its improvement is the core of this conversation. It's the biggest barrier to new public utilities, and it's an issue that long-term existing public utilities are dealing with as we transition. So across the board, reliability, affordability, clean energy adoption are the major drivers of concern for all utility models that we spoke with. With that, and all people we spoke with served under utility models, because we did speak with individuals served under investor-owned utilities as well. With that, it's also important to note that reliability and affordability come first and foremost over clean energy adoption. When those are secured, clean energy adoption does tend to be more efficient. Also, clean energy adoption has been helping some communities with affordability. The dynamic relationship between utilities of differing models makes one-to-one comparison or an apples to apples performance comparison challenging. It has a lot to do with service size. It has a lot to do with density. And it's also simply because different communities have different energy needs and they have a different historical path. Um, and they have a different historical path to make it. Sorry, I got distracted by that chat. We will make sure you get the right link. But they have a different historical path that brought them to where they are. Um, Lastly, energy equity and climate adaptation is not a major focus for existing public power industry. Their focus is, like most of the industry, on reliability and affordability across the board. And I can pass that off to Jackson, I believe.
Yeah. So I'm going to highlight just kind of insights in a couple other categories and then kind of our major sort of equity concerns insights. So there was a cluster of insights kind of around this idea of the governance structure and how governance relates to equity. One is that the structure of municipal utility governance shapes effectiveness and community relationships, that there is a wide array of how municipal utilities are governed. And for better or worse, those different models, whether it's a council, a utility board, whether that board is elected or appointed, the shape of that has an impact on how the community relates to the utility. Changing long-standing leadership structures, whatever they are, is a very tough thing, particularly as we'll talk about in the big insights when it's a matter of when it's a matter of power dynamics within a community and people who have historically held power in a community also holding power over utility management. Small communities that are operating or considering public utilities struggle with the idea of, retaining and recruiting experienced leadership. We talked to some utilities that are serving 800 towns of 800 or 1,000 people, and getting a general manager to come in and manage a utility, or even for some of them, just a concern about having like electrical workers who can maintain the lines, was a serious concern. So one of these sort of governance and management issues is really around how utilities of various sizes will operate. And despite those challenges, governance is one of the main reasons communities cited around the pride in public power. Even in the same interviews, people would be sharing serious frustrations with their utility and highlighting how very important it was that they controlled and had governance over their utility. So there's this interesting thing where even as people were frustrated, the fact that they had governance power mattered a lot. I'll go to the next slide. So this last set was and again, here we are summarizing greatly, but we tried to highlight what sort of policy changes and structural changes were sort of sought by the stakeholders we were talking to. One thing that was very clear is that public utilities need financial support to improve equity in the climate transition. This is a largely under-resourced sector, especially for the smaller utilities that are serving small communities. Making the energy transition and ensuring that transition is equitable simply requires resources that aren't always held at the local level. One thing that came up is that regional energy planning and consistent incentives would aid in making plans for transition. So, if you're developing a clean energy project, knowing what the incentives are going to be and what they're going to look like for the foreseeable future, right, make a big difference. So consistency of planning, knowing how that clean energy put on the grid is going to be valued in the transmission system, makes a big difference for folks as well. On the front of sort of the ownership transitions, when we're in situations where people are trying to take over from the IOUs, it came up that the financial, legal, and technical processes for municipalization should be made clearer and fairer. So in many cases, there's a lot of gray area of, we know the community has a right to buy the infrastructure and start their own utility. How exactly does the exercising of that right work? And between the communities and the incumbent utilities that have every reason to protect their monopoly, the relative resources to shape that gray area tend to live with the utilities. So there has been this point around having clearer and fairer processes that level the playing field. And that finally, and we're going to hear a good bit about this, is that larger scale public power institutions may offer an answer to some of these local struggles, be that with sort of prioritizing equity and climate transition over just keeping the lights on, or just figuring out how to coordinate and source power, that different institutional arrangements for either building new publicly owned generation, building the infrastructure to move power around, may help to address some of the challenges that seem unsolvable when you're just looking at a very small local utility. I'll go to the next slide. So, and these were kind of us kind of creating some buckets for insights from the conversations, trying to sort of reflect back, what did we hear from all the people we were talking to? This was, I will remind everyone, there's a tremendous amount of conversation. So to say this is boiled down is a terrific understatement. But we wanted to highlight what stood out to us as major sort of equity concerns and insights for action associated with them. So as we're thinking about the sort of emergence of a new and expanded public power sector, it's become clear that the sort of single community municipalization strategy is not a viable option for many frontline or under-resourced communities. While there are simply that for many folks, the thought of going to bat with your incumbent utility, buying all of that infrastructure and somehow resourcing the construction of generation and being able to make all that work fiscally. Particularly, we talked to a number of post-emergency management cities in Michigan. This is a big lift. And if there's a path to public power, that is not going to be the easiest path. A second big concern is that the governance and management of public utilities as they currently exist tend to reflect the broader structures of economic power that exist more widely. Industrial users still tend to see lower rates and more representation, while residential users face higher rates and less access to the decision-making spaces. It should be noted this is usually not as extreme in public power settings as it is in investor-owned utility settings. But that fundamental sort of truth about the structure of power in this country stays true in public power settings as well. So this remains a challenge that has to be addressed in the incumbent and in the emerging sector. And finally, that improving public health and climate adaptation are not usually the highest priorities for the public power sector and many municipal governments. And this is not so much a matter of critiquing the ethics of these institutions as much as it is they're basically looking at, how do I keep the lights on, right? And how do I keep the power as cheap as I can? And those are still kind of the driving forces for many municipal utilities. And as we tried to sort of highlight what were some sort of major insights and sort of action orientations for this, we wanted to highlight that clear alternative models for advancing public ownership beyond, but not necessarily in competition with, the traditional single community municipalization campaign need to be developed, right? We need to start exploring these alternate strategies that make sure that we can move all communities together. They're not necessarily in contradiction with the traditional municipalization campaign, but that these other tactics need to be sort of baked into the buckshot. We think there's a lot the historic and emergent public power sectors can learn and benefit from each other with a shared agenda and spaces to convene. We have found that in many instances, the incumbent power sector has a lot of experience managing and running utilities that the emergent public power sector, which is primarily campaigners and organizers, does not have. And those campaigners and organizers have clear visions and strategies around energy transition and equity that are not as central in the incumbent public power industry and will be essential for that industry to stay relevant as history marches on. And so spaces to convene and align the incumbent and emerging sectors stood out as a big action insight. And finally, communities pressing for municipalization and communities pressing for improvements from their incumbent utilities can benefit from strategic alignment. We're going to hear some case studies of this in the conversations over the course of the convening, but it is very possible to be pressing for public power transitions and pressing for accountability and improvement from the incumbent utilities where that transition isn't the first strategy on people's minds. I would not take this. I just want to say about this as this was our best attempt to condense a tremendous amount of conversation into some key outcomes and key sort of insights for action. And I think that as sort of authors and interviewers, we welcome the questions, critiques, and kind of what does this open up? What are the deeper conversations that need to be had? And I will kick it back to Colin to just close out this section before we start moving on to other things.
Yeah, thanks, Jackson and Eric. So yeah, just to close out, at the end of the report are attached some toolkits. So these toolkits are designed for specific stakeholder groups provided in the report. There are public power communities, public power campaigns, city leaders with municipal owned utilities, and city leaders considering municipally owned utilities. So these toolkits focus on collective insights on equity concerns as well as collective action. And they provide resources to help inform communities on creating and sustaining public utility models. And we hope that the connections that people make here today by those in attendance can also help serve in that same regard. And just want to thank all the interviewees and participants that helped provide the experiences to build the capacity of others in these spaces and help us design these toolkits. And then just a general thank you to our steering committee. It was mentioned before. These are the members and organizations that lent time to help direct some of this work, and as well as the organizations that helped fund this. So thank you so much for being here. We're excited to have you here. We're excited for the panelists and speakers that we have in the different sections. We're really excited and grateful, and hope that we can all be resources to each other and build capacity and support. Thank you.
Good. So we're gonna move on to our next section in 5 minutes. I would welcome and Liz, I think we can open up. Folks can either drop questions in the chat, or we can turn on mics. So if folks want to raise hands or come off mute, we can take a couple minutes for questions if folks have them, knowing that we probably don't have quite enough time to get into all of them. And we will then transition into some further grounding from Isaac and Justin. If there are no questions or reactions, I will be shocked.
Just great info so far. A lot of great work.
Thanks, Deirdre. I'd also welcome just reactions. Like if folks are like, I don't have a question, but there's like something, this triggered some thought for me. I would welcome that as well. Whatever deeper thoughts or reflections are emerging.
Yes, hi, it's Jay Powell, San Diego. I got the impression that our small public power agencies, in small communities in jeopardy due to some of the challenges that you all identified. It sounded like you're saying there's really some challenges at a certain scale that are already being experienced, attracting the right management talent and resources, that sort of thing. So is there a certain scale that you're looking at that might be a more optimum number of customers or size of a community that should organize and try to municipalize or have public power, nonprofit power?
I would say that we didn't quite get to the place with this process of here's the recommendation of this is exactly where it makes sense. I think the question of like where a particular tactic to expand public power makes sense is very situational. I can share that some of the particular situations that highlighted this were there was a small utility in Iowa that serves around 800 people that still tends to have more reliable and lower cost power than surrounding places. It's also connected to the entire energy system by a single transmission line. And in discussions with them, one of the interesting things about the small utility is they still have like an oil generator, right? This town of 800 still has a sort of fuel oil like power generation unit that is very important to their resilience in their view, the ability to make their own power. And furthermore, is something that they get asked to turn on by their independent system operator. So by their transmission operator, when there are power deficiencies on the grid, they get a request to say, "Hey, turn on your fuel plant because we need you to meet your own power needs to deal with this demand problem on the grid." And so I think like that's one example of where like it's a small utility and the idea of making an energy transition would mean shutting down that plant, and that raises a lot of very practical problems for the community. And additionally, that was one of the places where we were like talking the most about like we don't see enough people coming out of the trade schools, and we don't know who's going to repair the lines in a certain number of years. There was the person who ran this fuel oil plant retired and then came out of retirement because they couldn't find anyone else to keep it running safely. It's a very specific story, but I think like it's our sense was there are a lot of situations like that of small utilities that exist in a very particular way, and the major shifts in technology are not something that they have the ability, at least inside their staffing, to really understand and pivot with easily. I saw Casey and then Sean.
Hey, yeah, thank you so much for all this work. I was curious, in one of the insights for action, you talked about communities who are currently pressing for municipalization to work with communities that are also trying to like put pressure on incumbent utilities. And I was wondering if there's, and it might be in the report, but if there is an example of a campaign like that currently happening, or if that's more of just like a insight and hope.
There are certainly examples in the report. I would say one that just stands out again, this is the one that I'm closest to, is Ann Arbor for Public Power is pressing a municipalization campaign, has also routinely showed up in support of other communities when they're fighting rate hikes from our incumbent utility, DTE, and showing up to press on their long-term energy plans. So there's been that's one example I would say of like solidarity work between fighting for improvements from an incumbent utility and pressing for public power on the other side. That wasn't the only one, but that's obviously one I'm very familiar with. We'll kick it to Sean, and then we are going to close out. We'll get one last one in.
Cool. Thanks so much, Jackson, and everybody that worked on this report. One of the questions that's coming to mind for me in multiple ways right now is the question of scale. And you were thinking about, like, yeah, individual communities are thinking about municipalization. They're running into political or technical roadblocks. This is something that I think I've seen us come up against this roadblock in Chicago and also other campaigns across the country many times, where we push for municipalization within Chicago, but ComEd service territory is all of Northern Illinois. So there's a very easy response of like, well, if Chicago does it, what about everywhere else? And so what does the scale look like there for building a mass base that can push for political power that also is not bounded by like city council, municipal like vote holders and decision makers? And then the flip side of that being at the federal level, what just happened with the Inflation Reduction Act and the direct pay stuff that kind of got snuck in there that helped out, I think, our fight for public power in the long run. We saw this with the Build Public Renewables Act winning in New York. Great. But that's federal scale. It's this sort of wonky thing. And a lot of that was people fighting at the federal level who are not super plugged into local, like, utility by utility boundaries. And so what's the relationship between those things? I'm not sure, but it's a question that's on my mind.
Eric, I'll get to you if you want.
I can engage with that. That is a question that is absolutely on our mind as well. A lot of this project, like, we had to limit the scope of the conversation, and that is one that's like one of the questions that becomes very prevalent. How do we expand this to be at a scale that covers a significant number of people in an equitable way? And one of the things we found, and we have to be like frank and honest about it, is that this is not an option for every community. And that's why, like, we do need to be pushing like energy policy that includes public power. The state of Michigan is trying to do that right now. It's boots on the ground from a number of environmental organizations, including Ann Arbor for Public Power. But it has to be a holistic approach to energy. And what became clear across the board is we need to demand a more humane service when it comes to energy generation, no matter if it's publicly owned or investor owned. We need more accountability for our investor owns because of that. So I hope that helped answer that some. Sorry.
And one thing I want to offer too is that as we were kind of putting this together, that I would put the question you asked in the category of questions that came up that did not have clear or obvious answers from the process. I do want to highlight one of the timing things that is worth lifting up is that there's another public power convening happening in October, which we're going to be with permission from the organizers are going to be sharing out to folks who registered for this, that I think is really going to be focused on building more of an integrated effort at public power organizing nationally, which I think is going to be a great opportunity for folks here potentially to dig deeper. That is going to be much more about conversation. A lot of this convening is like hearing from people, right? But